Shalom, shalom, and we are going to continue this series that we have begun in order to reach out to those Jews in the church, in the Messianic congregations, and even among those who are considered Netzarim. Netzarim is a new group that has been formed in lieu and very similar to the Chabad movement, except they have a different Rebbe, and which they call Yehoshua. So I want to look at in this series that in fact Jesus, not only that his practice was Judaism, but he went a step further than that. You know, the old question that many Christians ask, what would Jesus do, comes to the focus point in this video. Because we need to understand that Jesus was a Jew, an observant Jew, and as an observant Jew, he would have us observe the laws of the Torah. And not only observe the written law, but also the oral law. And I'm going to show that in this video as an indication that if you in fact do what Jesus said according to the historical Jesus, the Jewish Jesus, there's no other excuse but to be an observant Torah Jew. Jesus asserted that the law of Moses should be observed, and as it's been instructed by the Pharisees. He was circumcised as a sign of the covenant between God and the children of Abraham. And Mary was even a faithful Jewish woman who performed what we know as Tahara Mishpacha, which is that ritual mikvah for the cleansing every month that the woman has her cycle, and especially a married woman. And as an infant, he was also taken to Jerusalem. He was presented to God, the Lord, with sacrifices being offered according to the Torah law. As a youngster, Jesus went to the temple in Jerusalem. He listened to the religious Jewish teachers of his time, the rabbis, and asked questions, probing questions, very deep questions. He just didn't take an answer because he just wanted to believe. He actually questioned the questions. He questioned the rabbi based upon what he was learning. In other words, from what basis, on what grounds. As Jews do today, he recited the blessing over bread, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. The rituals by the temple priests and the gifts given at the temple altar were recognized as proper Jewish observance and duty. Tithing and fasting, something that a lot of Christian preachers are really good of demanding from their congregants, was part and complete in the life of Jesus, and they were accepted as Jewish functions by him. Jesus observed the Shabbat by attending synagogue, where he learned, taught, and read the Hebrew Scriptures. The synagogue was then, as it is now, a place of prayer. Religious education was the primary focus. The Pharisees and other learned men in Judaism were very familiar with the different questions and answers and details, minutiae of the law. He also got involved with that area of the minutiae of the law. The Pharisees were to speak and listen. So we know that Jesus spoke Hebrew. We also know that he spoke Aramaic, which was the language of the people, the learning people. It was a Semitic language, very similar to Hebrew. And he knew the Hebrew Scriptures very well. There's a question whether or not he knew Greek or not, since if he were, as it's stated in Talmud Sanhedrin, of the government, in other words, of the dynasty of David, he would have been permitted to learn and speak in Greek. But we have no proof to that except as an inference by the position he held. In addition to that, the multitudes of the people, all of them Jews, heard him speak in Hebrew. The sanctity of Jerusalem's temple was highly respected by Jesus, who believed it was the house of prayer for all people. He looked at it as a very holy thing, and even when he saw that it was going to be destroyed, he made an inference that it can be rebuilt. Of course, he was familiar with and participated in all the Jewish holidays, as a Jew would. Sukkot, Passover are especially recorded throughout the New Testament. Especially we have an outline found in the pages of the New Testament itself. All of this reveals that Jesus was not only a Jew, he was not an assimilated Jew, he was an observant Jew. Now, let's look at the passages from which presents the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, while we're looking at these passages, I want us to ask, why would Jesus be immersed in the laws and customs of Judaism if his whole entire mission was to undo them, extinguish them, and destroy them? It just makes no sense. Now, in Luke chapter 2, verse 21, we read, "And when the 8 days were accomplished for circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus." And I want you to notice, it does not say Emmanuel. Why am I making this reference? Because many Christians always make reference that Jesus' name was Emmanuel. No, his name was Jesus. And of course that is a Greek for the word in Hebrew, Yehoshua, which was a very common name. Luke chapter 2, verse 22. "And when the days of Mary, or Mary's purification, was completed, she went to the mikvah, ritual cleansing, and according to the laws of Moses, were accomplished." Luke chapter 2, verse 22, verse 20 through 24, and verse 27 and 29. "And they, his parents, brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." Now here, Lord does not refer to Jesus, because obviously he was a child, and thus it refers to God. As it is written in the law of the Lord, "Every male that openeth up the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves and 2 young pigeons." And when the parents brought in the child Jesus, what do we read? They did this to do after the customs of the law. In other words, this was known as Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. Jesus was the firstborn of Mary. "And when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord." Again, we see the observance of the parents of Jesus, both mother and father. Yes, Mary, his mother, and yes, Joseph, his father. And we're going to get into that a little bit later when we look at the lineage and the story, or the alleged story of him being birthed up by a virgin without a father, but by the Holy Spirit. In Luke chapter, we'll look at that a little bit later, but Luke chapter 2, verse 46 through 47, "As a young boy, after 3 days, found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions." In other words, we see Jesus is probing questions to the rabbis, the learned rabbis and doctors of the law, the expert, the scholars, and not just settling with their answers. Luke chapter 24, verse 30, we read, "He took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to them." 2 things we learn here. First of all, they continued the customs of the rabbis of breaking and blessing bread, which would have been hamotzi lechem min haaretz. In addition to that, he broke the bread, contrary to a custom that is of recent, which is to take a knife and cut the bread. We learn through here that one of the most oldest custom is to take the challah and break it with your hands and then give it to them, or as the Sephardic custom is to, as it were, toss it, but as not to throw it. So we see that even Jesus' custom was very, you might say, Yerushalmi type of customs. Now in Mark chapter 1, verse 44, and Matthew chapter 8, verse 4, and Luke chapter 5, verse 14, we read, "Show thyself to the temple priest," or to the priest, "and offer for thy cleansing those things which Moses commanded for a testimony unto them." In other words, again, we see Jesus emphasizing the observance and the requirements to do what Moses had instructed. So he was not an antinomian, anti-law preacher, as some would think he was. Luke chapter 17, verse 14. "Go, show thyself unto the priest," which was a requirement by the law when the person was purified from his leprosy or from his ailment. Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 through 24. "Therefore if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and remember remember that thy brother has aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift." Here we have a perfect example that before you're going to offer something to God on the altar, leave it there, go take the problem that you have with your brethren, resolve it, come back, and then offer your offering to God, which usually had been an offering, a sacrifice. Now here we find something very fascinating. One thing that we find fascinating is that Jesus, in fact, by saying this, is teaching the importance of Achdut, of unity of the Jewish people, of having peace among the brethren, because one thing that destroys the relationship between Jew and a Jew is having a hatred in one's heart against each other. And that creates a wall of separation. What one word can do to destroy that wall of separation is that one word, which is, we say, slicha, forgive me, or forgiveness. Yet, in today's Jewish world, we see how difficult that has become a reality, and we're seeing that the walls of Achdut begins to break down. This Jesus taught. He taught about Jewish unity and the importance of that. What do we also see here? We see another thing. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, he quotes Isaiah regarding the manner in which to fast, not to be publicly seen, but to be rewarded publicly by God, in doing so in a very quiet manner. Matthew 23, verse 23, and Luke chapter 11, verse 42. Ye pay tithe of the mint and anise and cumin, or the herbs, and have omitted the weightier matter or the heavier matter of the law, which is judgment, mercy, there's chesed, and emunah. These ought you have done, and not to leave the other undone. In other words, Jesus was not advocating to forget the details of the law, but also not to forget the heavier issues, the more important issues, because both the minor as well as the major are of equal importance. Mark chapter 1, verse 21, we read, and straightway on the Shabbat day he entered into the synagogue and taught. Mark 3, verse 1, we read, and he entered again in the synagogue. Mark chapter 6, verse 2, we read, and in Matthew chapter 13, verse 54, we read, and when the Shabbat day was come and began to teach in the synagogue, he was a moreh, without a doubt. He was an instructor of Torah. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, and Jesus went about all the cities and villages teaching in their synagogues. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, and Mark chapter 1, verse 39. And Jesus went about all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Now that sounds so non-Jewish. Gospel of the kingdom. What is that? Well, you'll find that in Isaiah, where the expression Besorot Tovot is mentioned. And that concept of Besorot Tovot is the good news. What good news? The good news of the law of the Messianic kingdom coming on earth, which implies directly Mosaic law being practiced within a constitutional government, imposed and directed by the king. Who did he think was the king? The one preaching, Jesus. And we're going to take a look at that when we look at the issues of did Jesus or was Jesus the Messiah or not. In Luke chapter 13 we read verse 10, and he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Shabbat. So we find Jesus heavily involved in synagogue life. Luke chapter 4 verse 16, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue, and on the Shabbat day he stood up to read. He learned Torah. He read from the Torah directly. He also read, as we know, not only the Maftir, but also what you might consider the Haftarah of the week. Matthew chapter 21, verse 23, and Mark chapter 11, verse 27. And when he was come into the temple, the chief priest and the elders of the people came unto him, as he was teaching or preaching the Besorot Tovot, what was the good news of the Mosaic law, the insights of the Mosaic law. John chapter 8, verse 2, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all of the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. Why were the people so early in the morning in the temple? They wanted to hear the special guest speaker. Who was there? It was Jesus. He had a charisma. He had a following. Luke chapter 21, verse 37 through 38. In that day he was teaching in the temple, and all the people came early in the morning to him in the temple for to hear him. Here we have a very indication what type of crowds he brought into the temple. He came to bring people in, not to take them out of temple life, of synagogue life, of Jewish life. Luke chapter 19, verse 47, and he taught them daily in the temple. Here we have an indication that he was there on a daily basis, because obviously Jews came every morning to pray and to offer the offerings of the morning, the offerings of the afternoon, the offerings of the evening. He was present there teaching prior to these offerings. Mark chapter 11, verse 17, and Matthew chapter 21, and Luke chapter 19, verse 46. And he taught in the temple, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? My house shall be called what? A bet tefillah, a house of prayer, of supplication. Mark chapter 11, verse 15 and 16. And Matthew chapter 21, verse 12 we read, And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple of God. And he began to cast them out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves, and wouldn't suffer that any man should carry any vessels through the temples. Here we see two distinct things that really upset Jesus. Number one, usury, or the price of the exchange of animals, had gone to such levels that it was completely considered robbery. So what did he do? He said, no, this is not the purpose. He overthrew the tables. What else did he do? He saw that people would carry their vessels through the temple, profaning the holiness of the temple. He stopped that, and this was his indignation. Whether he was right or wrong, we see a Jesus that was zealous for Judaism and Judaism's law. John chapter 7, verse 10. And then went he also up to the Feast of Tabernacle, that's Sukkot. John chapter 7, verse 14 we read, Now about the midst of the Feast of Tabernacle, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. Chapter 2 of Luke we read, verse 41 through 43. Now his parents went into Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the customs of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days. Now he was 12. That means one more year he would have been bar mitzvahed, right? Yeah, interesting. So Jesus must have had a bar mitzvah. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 through 19. Mark chapter 14, verse 12 and 16. We read, Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, that's Passover, the disciples came to Jesus, now he's having followers, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? In other words, Jesus, where do you want us to organize the Passover Seder? And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Luke chapter 22, verse 15. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you. In other words, this is so important to me. It's a big mitzvah for me to eat with you guys this Passover Seder and be part of the celebrations. It doesn't end here, my friends. There's more of the Jesus practical Judaism here. And what do we read? We read, and he said unto them, It is one of my disciples, one of the 12, that dipped with me in the ceremonial dish. What dish would you think that could have been? Some would say salt water. Others would say it was probably the bitter herbs that they had to dip into it. But clearly and very direct, Jesus let people know that there was one among them that was going to be a bitter experience to him and to the rest of the group. And we know that according to the stories of the gospel, that happened to be Judas Iscariot, who happened to be the treasurer of the group, and also happened to be a zealous. In other words, he was a warrior. He was one of these rebel types. Now, we read also here that in Mark chapter 14, verse 22, And as they did eat, Jesus took unleavened bread, or matzah, and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Again, making reference to the custom of the Jerusalem custom of breaking the bread, not cutting it with a knife, which also is the custom of many Sephardics throughout the world. Mark chapter 14, verse 23, and Matthew 26, verse 27. And he took the wine, or the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them. He said the blessings over the wine. Borei peri hagefen. I would imagine, I'm curious, I wonder if he would have said hagafen or hagefen. Now there's the Ashkenazic pronunciation or more the Yerushalmi pronunciation of hagefen. That would be interesting research, wouldn't it? Well, let's continue further in Mark chapter 14, verse 26, and Matthew 26, verse 30. And when they had sung the hymn, what hymn is sung during Passover? It's Hallel, the great praise, Psalms 119. Now, not only did Jesus observe Judaism's law, but much maligned Pharisees are shown in the New Testament to have been the value dispensers, the value messengers of God's word in Jesus' own estimation. Furthermore, Jesus had friends among the Pharisees. We think that Jesus had all these Pharisees that were against him, and that is not the case. As a matter of fact, we learned that one of the primary Pharisees saved his life on many occasions. We have such a record in the New Testament as one called Joseph of Arimathea, which happens to be the same Joseph bar Ari, says my son Ari Matea, which happens to be, those of you who are historian buffs, Joseph Flavius, the historian. He was a very powerful individual. He was also very well connected to Rome and had the ear of Caesar. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later on when we visit the situation of the alleged resurrection, or perhaps, better said, the resuscitation, the salvation of Jesus from the very grips of death by this gentleman named Josephus, the Pharisee. But he was not the only one. We had Nicodemus, who was also, according to the Talmud, Nicodemus, who happened to be of such great wealth that for 8 to 10 years he could have supported, sustained all Jews in Israel for a period of prolonged hunger. In other words, he was so wealthy, he was the Bob Gates of that time. So I want you to understand and remove this picture of a Jesus who's poor in the manger, suffering. No wonder Judas had the donation purse. He was a treasurer. He had a lot to worry about. Now, Christianity should place the Pharisees in the proper regard and end the disparagement of the names of the Perushim. Granted, the Talmud in Sota mentions that there were 7 types of Perushims that would take a person out of this world because they exhibited such levels of fanatic extremism that instead of bringing people to the world to come, the world of bliss, they would actually take them to the other direction because of the extremities of their teachings. Now we read here very plainly that the Pharisees even sought to save his life. In addition, many came to him to be healed. Matthew chapter 23, verse 1 through 3, we read, Then spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. This is Kisei Moshe. In other words, this is the seat of Moses, which they had the power and right to interpret the law. They were the poseks. They were the ones that would interpret Jewish law and gave, if necessary, rabbinical dictums of the time. And it says, all therefore, he says, listen to what Jesus says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Question, if this is what Jesus is telling his disciples, his Jewish disciples that were following him, my Jewish friend who are involved in the Messianic, in the Christian church, why don't you observe what Jesus said, which was to listen to the Pharisees and the scribes, to listen to the oral law, to listen to the rabbinical teachings? Instead of criticizing, saying these laws are the laws of men, you should be saying, no, these were the laws that were given by Moses and given by those interpreters, sanctioned by the very seat of Moses, for us to live by and to practice. You see, we begin to change our way of thinking, don't we? We begin to change. In fact, what Jesus actually said was, as a Jew, you're supposed to be observing Torah observance. You're supposed to be keeping Shomer Shabbat. the Sabbath. You're supposed to be keeping even the laws of kashrut. And we're going to see that in a few seconds, how we can see that Jesus himself ate with the rabbis and ate the meat and the bread that they prepared, indicating his approval of the meat and the bread. So any of you Jews for Jesus, any of you Messianic Jews, or I would even include these wannabe Jews who dress up like Jews, listen to what Jesus says in this point. You've got to be observant. You've got to listen to the Pharisees and the scribes. So stop this negative talk about the Pharisees. They provided the word of God to the Jewish people, and Jesus said very clearly, you have to listen to them. Listen to what they tell you to observe and do it. So to those preachers out there with their big mega churches, and I'm speaking to a lot of these pastors in Miami and in the United States, that they don't mind talking about the law when it has to do with tithing and giving money over to them. Listen to what Jesus says here. He says you are to listen to the Pharisees and to the scribes and what they're teaching on the rabbinical level. Why do you disrespect what Jesus said by demeaning the words of the rabbis, the words of the Pharisees, and the words of the scribes? Why do you do that? If you were a pastor, if you were a leader, I would challenge you to come listen to the words of the rabbis. You may learn a couple of things. In Luke chapter 13, verse 31, what do we read? The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, Get thee out and depart hence, for Herod will kill you. The Pharisees saved Jesus' life not only one time, but more than once. Luke chapter 5, verse 17, he was teaching. Jesus was teaching. The Pharisees were come out from every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and had the power of the Lord present to heal them. It's not that Jesus healed them because he wanted to heal. The expression here is that he had the power of God to be able to know that God was going to heal these people. There was certain esoteric info that he was able to understand by the way the interpretation of the law was that was present to be able to heal. It doesn't end there, my friends. Luke chapter 7, verse 36, and Luke chapter 11, verse 37. And one of the Pharisees desired that he would eat with him. Come, in other words, is my house kosher enough for you, Jesus? In other words, and what did Jesus say? Of course it is. And he went into the Pharisee's house, and he sat down to meat. Why is meat such an issue here? Why does it mention in the gospel that he sat down to eat meat? Because unlike modern day Jews who don't keep kosher, or modern day Messianic Jews who decide to go eat at the local Denny's and say, oh well, I'm saved by grace. No, my friends, Jesus sat down to a kosher supper, and he knew it was kosher meat slaughtered according to the prescribed ritual laws, according to the rabbis, according to the Pharisees. So he was able to eat this meat. He knew it was kosher. Did he refuse? Absolutely not. Luke chapter 14, verse 1. He went up into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Shabbat day. He went into the house. It was custom to go to other people's house and share the Shabbat meal. Enjoy Torah topics. This was what Jesus was all about. Torah was his life. He was an observant Jew. Now, here's a couple of things I'm going to direct to my Messianic friends, my Jews for Jesus friends, my Jews for Christianity friends, my Jews who basically love the church world. What would Jesus do? That's the question Christians always ask. What would Jesus do if he was invited to a house who had a nice plate of pork? What do you think he would do? Before you answer that, I'm going to say a blessing over the water. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol nihya bidvaro. blessing God for the sustenance of water. I'm sure Jesus would have done that too. And I'm sure that most of the things that Jesus would do would be very similar to an Orthodox Jew today. Why am I bringing this out? Because there's no justification. And I'll direct my words to my good friend's Chaver, Dr. Michael Brown, and I hope someone would forward this video to him. Mr. and Dr. Brown, Jesus would not go eat treif. You will need to prove to your audience that Jesus promoted eating treif at the local McDonald's or local Burger King or the local Kentucky Fried Chicken that does not have the seal of approval. This is why I'm saying it's so interesting that you talk about Jesus being this and being that, and yet the essential faith of Jesus' own belief in God indicates he would have done not what you're doing. He would have been an observant Jew, not driving on Shabbat. He would be walking to a person's house to enjoy the glory and the heavenly taste of heaven on earth called Shabbat. And yet you insist you believe him to be. Michael, unfortunately, I must say that if that is your Jesus, he's no different than Christianity's Jesus. And in response to your rhetorical questions to our radio show, which, by the way, I'm still expecting a re-invite. After all, you did publicly invite me. I'm still waiting for a re-invite. One thing is very clear. Jesus would not come to a Messianic congregation today where they serve non-kosher food, or food that was cooked in a way that would render it non-kosher. Jesus would not, my friend, be driving to your local Messianic congregation. My friend, Jesus would not be going and following and saying to Michael, you're big in the kingdom of God. And I'm just only using Michael Brown, and it's not to belittle him at all, but it's to bring to the point down to earth that the message of Jesus is completely different than the message of Paul. And when you begin to see the distinction, you begin to realize, hey, Jesus was an Orthodox observant Jew. One thing is very interesting to note is that Jesus is depicted as wearing even Jewish men's religious tzitzits. The wearing of these garments is a commandment by God in Numbers chapter 15, verse 38 through 39, and we read that they made fringes on the borders of their garments to remember all of the commandments, and actually it's 613. And in Matthew chapter 14, verse 36, we infer that Jesus is wearing the tzitzits garment as we read, and the men besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. In other words, the tzitzits of his garment. Why would these Jewish men want to touch his tzitzits? Because they had looked that this man was not only a man that would be a preacher and teacher, he practiced what he preached. He observed the commandments. He was a commandment observer. Now, in our next video, we're going to take a look that not only did Jesus practice what he preached as an observant Jew, many times he went beyond that, but something else he did. That in fact he taught that you need to follow the law. That the law of the Torah, the law of Moses, both the written and the oral, is great to be saved for salvation. In other words, you can find salvation through the law. Now this, of course, is going to pose a lot of problems to a lot of your typical Christian mindset or Messianic mindset, and in some cases those that still have trouble relinquishing the idea that you can be saved through the law, because it goes contrary to Paul's teaching that no one is justified by the law. I'm going to show you in our next video that not only are we justified by the law, that the law produces life It also can produce death, but it can produce life, it produces forgiveness, it produces a whole bunch of things, and the law contains also all of the promises that God has wanted for the children of Israel in the world. So if that is the case in point, why belittle the holy, pure law of God and make the law of no use by denying it all? This is something that you Christians and Messianics need to come and confront. Jesus fulfilled the law by practicing it. He didn't merely fulfill it for himself so that everybody else can therefore no longer abide by it and put it to practice. And we're going to take a look at these passages in our next video. So do me a favor. Those of you who are contacted with other pastors and Christian ministers and Messianic leaders, forward this email, forward this video to them. This video is specifically to reach out to those Jews in the church, to those Messianic believers, to those Jews wannabe, cardiac Jews. If Jesus observed the law, point clearly, why don't you? Shalom, shalom, and we'll see you in our next video, The Faith of Jesus, Judaism.